Amid Ein Aleph Amid Aleph, and we're going to start with the we stopped at a good stop last week, so we're starting with the Tanya Reb Shimon ben Eliezer Omer. Let's find that. Here we go. It's maybe about a dozen, 15 lines from the top, almost the very first word of the line. Let's see, 3, 6, 9, 12, maybe more, maybe 18 lines. Reb Shimon ben Eliezer. Right. So now the Gemara is going to give us sort of vignettes. It's going to give us brises with chedushim. In other words, this isn't like a full sugya where we're going to go back and forth. We will to a degree, but at this point in the discussion of ribbis, the Gemara wants to give us some tidbits, things that we haven't been able to fully discuss in what we've been doing. And this Mishnah, where we talk about malva to a akum, to a non-Jew, how that works. And as I say, it's going to expand itself a little bit. Today, we're going to talk about ger tzedek, ger toshav. Again, these are a little bit on the fringe of the discussion of ribbis, but nevertheless, the Gemara wants to include it in a full understanding of what is ribbis and how it works. Says the Brisa, Tanya, Rabbi Shimon ben Eliezer Omer. It says Ein Aleph Amid Aleph, about 15, 16 lines to the top, more or less. Rabbi Shimon ben Eliezer says as follows: Kol mishi eish lo ma'os. This is like a general rule. I mean, it's obvious, but it's a general rule. Anybody who has money, in other words, if you have money available, you're not necessarily so tight that you have no extra money. Umalva osam shelo beribis, and he lends it. He doesn't sit on it. This is an important distinction. He actually goes out and makes loans without interest. Allah of Omer, on him, on such a person, the Torah. This is all in Vayikra, where we talk about Neshech and Tarbis. On him, the Pasuk says, Kaspel anosan beneshech. Right? Vishochad al noki lo lokach. The pasuk that says that he hasn't given out money, lent money on interest. Also, vishochad, meaning a bribe, he has not taken against a noki, against an innocent person. Is ose ele, if he does these things, then lo yomut lo olam, then he shall never be lessened. So that's a general term. We're going to have to understand what lo yomut actually means. But he says that he won't be lessened, lo yomut, from the word miut. He won't be memayet le'olam. So, holamarta, what do we learn from this brisa? Shekol ha'malva beribis, that someone who does, and again, the antithesis of this, as someone who actually does lend money beribis, with interest, nechosav mismartin, then his eventually he will be mismayet, he will be lessened. His possessions, his money, everything about him will be lessened. So again, it seems fairly obvious. If the Bryce is telling us on the positive side, then we can assume that on the negative side, that if he does that, that he will be mismayet. So we've had this general discussion in the past when we were talking early on about ribbis. We said that someone who lends in ribbis, his assets will diminish. I mean, he'll lose by it, and someone who doesn't won't. So we have to understand, what is this brisa, what is he summing up, or is he telling us a chiddush? What is he saying? But basically, it's the obvious. If you don't lend in ribbis, but it also adds the pasuk, and you don't take shochad, you don't take a bribe, then you won't falter. You won't be hurt. You won't be punished, whether it's physically or monetarily or spiritually.
You'll be prosperous.
You'll yeah, prosper. Right, right. That's a good way of a word that encompasses everything, but it does include both the physical, right,
It's spiritual.
and spiritual. Okay, so
Rabbi, can I get a clarification?
yes,
So it says if um one doesn't lend with ribbis. So the first question is that it will not lessen him. Doesn't say he will prosper. It says he will not lessen him.
right,
So he will remain, but it doesn't say his wealth will grow. It just says he will not be diminished.
right. But that's by inference. You're right, Michael. That's by inference that he will not be lessened, but quote unquote he'll prosper. But right, that's the inference from what Jay just said. Prosper. That's the inference from the pasuk.
Okay. And the converse, so if somebody does, but what if somebody has money and doesn't loan it, doesn't do that? So what does that mean? So it says conversely, he will be lessened if he lends with ribis, if he takes a bribe. But what happens if he does nothing and he has the opportunity to do so?
So that's an excellent question because that's what falls between the gap. And what we're saying here is that you should lend and you should lend without interest. Not lending isn't a chiyuv, it isn't a negative, but it's not a positive either. So if a person's sitting on a lot of money and he just refuses to lend, so he's not going to be over on ribis because he's not lending, but neither is he helping anybody. So such a person is like, when we use the term a Beinoni, you can't fault him because he didn't do an Isser, but neither can you give him any shvach, can you give him anything positive because he has an opportunity of doing a mitzvah and he didn't do the mitzvah. So your point is exactly that. He falls in that little crack of a person who is neither going to falter or prosper. In other words, what he is, he is. Rebbeinu Shalom is not going to punish him for not lending. You can't do that in the reverse because the mitzvah is that you should lend and you should lend without ribbis. So if a person doesn't lend, you can't fault him for ribbis, but neither can you give him the opportunity to prosper and to have something positive happen to him. So such again, with the end result is such a person, we don't know how we'll go through life, but certainly we are not lauding him as saying that he's someone who has done mitzvahs or has done something positive. I mean, there are a number of mitzvahs for the Torah. Let's give me an example, and just thinking out loud. There's a mitzvah of tzitzis. What's the mitzvah of tzitzis? If you wear a beged of four corners, you have to put on tzitzis. But if you don't wear a beged of four corners, what have you done? Are you over a lav? Of course
No,
not.
no, no, no.
You're not over a lav, but neither did you do the mitzvah. So
Yeah.
the Torah is telling us wear the beged and do the tzitzis, right? Wear the beged and don't do the tzitzis. Okay, that's a negative. Don't wear a beged at all. Of course, you can't punish and say that the person is over a lav. So we have mitzvahs like that, Michael, where the Torah is giving us a positive encouragement to do a mitzvah, but the opposite is not necessarily avera. The opposite is the lack of the opportunity to do a mitzvah. And how will be held accountable is a question. Every time you could have done and didn't do, is that a strike? Is that strike one, strike two? Maybe you can't strike out, you can foul tip, but you certainly aren't getting any hits here. So, using that analogy. But in any event, it's a good point, and that's exactly what Rabbi Lazar, Shimon ben Elazar is trying to tell us, is that there is a positive and that there is a negative, but by inference, there's a middle ground which has no positive and no negative to it.
But
Okay,
don't we have the basic principle that we're expected to do mitzvahs?
right.
And I think that came from the Aseret Dibros somewhere.
Well, because generally, there's mitzvahs of kum va'aseh, kum, get up va'aseh and do, right? Be proactive. And then there's something called shev va'al ta'aseh.
I'll say, yeah.
And shev va'al ta'aseh means be passive and don't do. But to your point, Michael, being passive and not doing isn't the same as kum va'aseh. It's not the same as actually being proactive to do the mitzvah. So that's how our system is aligned, that we have positives and negatives, and then we have sort of the Beinoni, the in between, which is neither. So Rav Shimon Gelezer in this brisa makes that point, and by inference, he's making the point that you just made, is that it says, Mishesh Lamars Umalve Osam Shelo Baribis. He does a positive act of lending, but that lending is not beribis. Then these praises are heaped on him. But it says specifically that he's malve, that he lends, not that he's sitting on money and doesn't do anything, right? So that, again, that's something we have to understand, is that our responsibility to our fellow man is to help, and helping
Yeah,
means
we
not
also
sitting
have
on a lot of money and not doing anything. That's
we
not
also
helping.
we also have positive commandments to do things.
Correct.
And the Shemaya have that. The Ahavta is Hashem.
Right.
So it's not like there's a neutral, safe zone automatically just being lying in bed and not getting out of bed. It's just that we're required to do the mitzvahs.
Right. Right. But inherently, there isn't an isser in not lending and therefore not being over in ribbis. It's not what we are encouraged to do. We're encouraged, if we have the opportunity and we have money, to do
Yeah.
that and to put ourselves out there to help somebody. And there are many people who say, I just don't lend. I'll do everything else, but I won't lend. This way I won't get involved in ribbis, but neither will I help anybody. All right, listen, that's the Beinoni. That's what the Muslim tells us we should avoid trying to do, but there's no isser. So now, having said this brisa, Rav Shimon ben Elazar makes the statement in this brisa, says the Gemara. But we see, in reality, the lomosve beribis, a person who goes ahead and lends money not beribis, becomes smatin, and he's lessened, right? In other words, we see this all the time. This is sort of the great question of when bad things happen to good people. A person is a good person. He lends without interest. He wants to help people, but on the other hand, he doesn't get ahead. So the basic question on the brisa is this brisa an automatic? Are you telling me if he lends without interest, he will be compensated and he won't falter? But that's not the reality. The reality is that we see that, and this kind, this Gemara asked this question, but so do many other Mefarshim. It isn't a given in life that if you follow the precept of the halacha, that the result will be what the halacha tells you it will be. It's not always, oh, you do it, it'll be good. Sometimes you do it and it's not good. So in other words, this is a basic question. And Michael, the question certainly applies to the person who doesn't lend. He sits on his hands. But even the person who does lend, and he lends without ribbis, oftentimes he's not rewarded. So what should we say? The Rebbeinu Shalom doesn't really come through? I mean, that's the question.
But Rabbi, what if instead of lending, someone gives to someone else?
Yeah.
So lending is obviously not necessarily because of poverty. It could be because of being illiquid. So, but it seems that it should be a greater mitzvah to help someone in need, to give to them rather than to lend to them. Is that not true? Or, I mean, because the halacha citing this, that, it's really a mitzvah to lend without interest.
But if you lend them, you're giving them dignity. If you give it to them without asking for something in return, that you're diminishing them and they don't have the dignity.
That's a very good point. In other words, what's the fine line between someone who has the money and can easily give it as a gift? No question about it. But he doesn't want to embarrass the person, like you say, David, or he wants the person to feel, oh, I'm a balachrayas, I'm going to borrow and pay back. I'll feel good because I paid back. And there's a feel good. I mean, many people are conscientious. and they take loans seriously, and it says, I'm going to pay you back. It's on my duty to pay you back. And when they do, they feel like a burden's lifted off their shoulder. Michael, you can give gifts all day long. A matana, these halachas don't apply to matanas. Okay? If someone wants to give a gift, he gives a gift. The Baruch Shalom, repays, doesn't repay. It's much harder to give a loan because with a loan, you're still tethered to that money. And by being tethered to that money, your expectation is that it will come back. And therefore, it's not, oh, I give it to you, it's out my door, I don't think about it, I don't have it anymore. There's a certain mentality when it comes to people who give gifts and say, I'd rather give it as a gift, not as a loan. I don't want to have this loan hanging over my head or the head of the borrower. I have the ability, I'll give a gift. And what is tzedakah? Tzedakah, of course, can be a loan, but many times you're giving the money outright. You're giving it away, and you're saying this money goes to help this particular person. I have no strings attached. I have no expectation of getting anything back. So, is that a higher form of charity overall when someone gives it away? I don't know. I don't know what many of this forum will say that Matas Beseser is the highest form of tzedakah. But then
Then
again,
you don't have a disappointment. So if you don't receive it back, you're not expecting it. So you're not disappointed.
correct, correct, and so, but this whole parsha of lending is meant for those who don't quite have the ability to say, I'm parting with this money forever. Okay, there are people who have no problem with it, but there are people who do have problem with saying, "Oh, I'm giving this $100. I will never have this again." So there's a halacha, lend it to him, and with the expectation that it will come back, and therefore you'll get the money back, and you'll get a mitzvah or schar for getting the money back. I don't know that that's a lesser form of tzedakah than outright gifting, but there are two different things. And it was created for many of the people who don't have the ability to say outright, I'm going to give away the money.
But Rabbi, if somebody donates to the Hebrew Free Loan Association of their jurisdiction,
Right,
then they are doing both. They're giving tzedakah
right.
and they are participating in a lending
That's a
without
very high and
interest.
noble cause. Absolutely.
So it should be that that is equal to lending to someone without interest at the very least, if not giving them even more.
I agree 100%, but it adds one layer, and that is that if someone comes to you and knocks on your door and you know him or you don't know him and he needs a loan and you say no problem, you give him a loan, then again you know who you're dealing with. The highest degree of tzedakah is not knowing who you're dealing with. So your point is well taken. If you give a matana to the Hebrew Loan Society, you're giving a matana and you're lending without attribution. That's the highest form
That's what
of
I would
tzedakah.
think. Yes.
I agree. That would be the highest form of tzedakah. You're doing both things, but on top of it, you're capping it with a cherry on top because the halacha is you shouldn't, really be dealing directly, which is
And
why
then
we
you take it off yourself and the borrower to be incumbent to you as opposed to an association that benefits the whole community.
right. So I don't have records to be able to tell you, and of course, a Hebrew Loan Society is a critical element in a community, but I don't have the knowledge to be able to say what percentage of that money comes as outright gifts, like you said, or comes as a loan where someone says, I'll put this money in as a perpetual loan and you lend it to whoever you feel needs it. And this way I don't have to be involved directly. There may be people like that who say, I don't want to give it as an outright gift. I'll give it to you. You hold it for 5 years. And in 5 years, lend it as many times as you can or as you want, help as many people. And in 5 years, you'll pay me back without interest. That's a big mitzvah. He's basically given up his money for a period of time. But statistically, it would be interesting if most of the money in the Hebrew Loan Society comes as outright gifts or actually comes as loans to the society to help other people. But anyway, this mitzvah of tzedakah is so central to who we are that Shimon ben Elazar has to say in this brisa, there are consequences to lending beribis or de facto not lending, okay. But then the kasha still is a good kasha. How do we reconcile someone who does all good and doesn't get the reward for it? That's a historical question that we've had from time immemorial, and it's not ironclad. So what do you do? So there's an interesting answer. I'm Rabbi Lazar. So Rabbi Lazar gives an answer which will make sense, but again, it will parse the whole issue. Halalu, someone who does not lend with interest, means he lends without interest. Mismatatin va'olin. So this is an interesting concept. He will falter and then he will rise. In other words, he's not going to falter and then just fall away. He'll falter, va'olin, and then he will rise. There is a promise, a haftacha, that someone who does good will not, if it looks bad, it's not bad la'olam. V'halalu, says Rabbi Lazar, those who do not lend on interest, meaning the category, he's referring here not to someone who lends with interest, but someone who doesn't lend. To your point, Michael. In other words, he's comparing someone who actually de jure lends and then doesn't seem to get the reward. He'll get the reward. But mismatin halolo, those who do not lend, I just simply won't lend. I'm not going to lend. I'm not going to put my money out there. Mismatin ve'elaolin, they may be memayet, they may be diminished and will not rise. So again, these are philosophical, ecclesiastical questions. Should you do this mitzvah lishma, or I'm going to get rewarded? I'm doing the mitzvah because I'm a good guy, but I want the reward. I want to better myself. So that's a separate question, because we say that even if someone comes in and does the mitzvah without the purest of intentions, at the end of the day, he'll be swept in and do it the right way. So if he lends because I know I'm going to get reward, okay, it's not so terrible, because eventually you'll come around, and you'll not do it for the reward. You'll do it for the satisfaction of the act. But what Rabbi Lezer is telling us is that someone who doesn't lend, like you mentioned before, Michael, he just doesn't lend. What's his lot? His lot is he won't benefit, but he may lose. In other words, he may be diminished, and then he won't be he won't be sort of rectified. So that
that's like
really
a punishment.
It's an encouragement to lend. Go ahead, Jay. Yeah.
It's like a punishment, though. The bottom line is
it seems to be.
Doesn't lend, yeah.
Yeah.
From the words, it doesn't seem like something somebody would want to do.
There's a problem with this, of course, which is that unless it comes down with a voice from on high, how do you know, oh, am I losing because of this? Am I losing because of that? Am I if you would make a loan with interest and the next day your other stocks went down, you'd be like, aha, I can't make money on this and I'm getting, losing it elsewhere,
Right.
And I should have never done it. Fine. That would be clear, maybe. But not losing money, because I didn't make a loan and now I lost some money. How would you even know? I mean, that's a constant challenge with mitzvahs as far
that's right. And it's not meant to sort of punish us and say, oh, you didn't lend, and therefore we're going to tie that together to your loss in another venue. But someone who learns the halacha and appreciates what we're saying will say to himself, listen, I have some money. I can sit on it, do nothing. I can invest it in a stock. I can do this. Or someone came to me and said they really need the money. I can help them out. I'll lend them the money. I won't charge interest. I know the Rebbe is going to pay me back. Forget about it. 6 months later, something happens. He gets a windfall. Does he necessarily associate it with the fact that he gave the loan 6 months earlier? No, of course not. But at the same time, when we pray for Parnasa, and we all know this, we pray for Parnasa on Rosh Hashanah, the Yom Noraim, And then the age-old question is, we're asking the Rabbanu Shalom to give us panasa. And the Rabbanu Shalom says in his book of deeds, I'm going to give panasa. We know the age-old question that we always ask. Should you get the panasa on day one? And then now, wow, my blessings were answered, and he gets nothing for the rest of the year. And then how does he feel? So this is a question that Chazal wrestles with this and says that bismanoi beito is you have to rely on the Rosh that he's going to give you what he gives you in the right time and in the right place in the right circumstance. So you could be going along, hopping along smoothly, everything is fine, and then one day you get a windfall, you make a deal, and say, "Wow, this is a bracha because I did good, or at least I feel I did good." And then nothing happens for another 6 months. Do you then say, "Oh, Rabbanu Shalom, you didn't do good by me because I was such a good person. You gave me once, you didn't give me a second time"? Again, we don't have the answer to that question. We wrestle with that question. But the point here, Menashe, you made it, is we don't necessarily connect the dots. We're not meant to connect the dots. I do a mitzvah, fine. I don't do a mitzvah, okay. So, but the upshot of Rabbi Elazar is he addresses the missing element in Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar's in his son Rabbi Shimon's question, because he answers it by saying that which was not clear in the question, I'm going to clarify, and I'm going to say that yes, people do good and then falter, but they don't falter permanently. They don't falter permanently. So when it says mismayet, we can understand mismayet as a temporary matter. But, says Rebbe Lezer, the person who does not lend, which was inherent in the question that Rebbe Shimon asked, but wasn't the specific point of the question, he answers by saying that such a person will not have the bracha, and will, if he's mismayet, he will necessarily be mismayet ve'ena olin, and he will not retrieve. So again, it's a musa haskell for all of us. I mean, we all have to sort of give our own din v'cheshbon, our own accounting balance. Look at our balance sheet. What are we about? What can we do? What we can't do? If someone can't, then there's no punishment for not lending if he's not able to lend. It's only someone who's able to lend and doesn't lend who may be in that category. But if the Baruch Shalom gives someone the ability to lend, then you have to do a din v'cheshbon. You have to say, that I'll do the best I can. Okay, so this gives us a little bit of an insight. That's why I say it's a vignette into understanding what it means to give tzedakah. What it means, to lend and give tzedakah, and what is included and what is not included. What's not included clearly is a person who lends with interest, and what's sort of the gray area is the person who doesn't lend. And so Rebbe Lezer clarifies that such a person may be in the position of not getting the benefits down the road. All right, so that's an important concept for us to understand. Okay. Now we're going to continue again, the same sort of general thought, but a little bit different. It says in the pasuk. In Novi, Lomo sabit bogdim tachrish bevala rosha tzadik mimenu. Why do you see Lomo tabit bogdim tachrish bevala rosha tzadik mimenu? Why do you see that someone who is someone who is sort of a Benini, he's not good, he's not bad, and he remains silent. Bevala, he doesn't speak. Russia tzadik bevala Russia mimenu. In other words, someone is on the sidelines and he sees someone bad doing something to someone good. All right, we see that all the time. Right, a Russia does to a tzaddik, punishes him, and there are people who watch and don't do anything. How were those people considered? In other words, you didn't do the negative. You didn't do anything to the tzaddik, but neither did you help the tzaddik. The tzaddik suffered from the rasha, and you did nothing. So that's that pasuk. And what's the upshot of that? Rav Huna. So Rav Huna says, Tzadik mimenu boleya, Tzadik gomer ain't a boleya. Um, to split the hair, as we just did in our case, between lending without interest and not lending. So Rav Huna gives explanation to that pasuk, that pasuk means that a person can see someone attacking the tzaddik. He can see that, but tzaddik gomer ain't a baleya. So he's splitting a hair here, and it's a very tough hair to split. In other words, there's someone who's a good guy. He may not be the best in the world, but he does good. We call him a tzaddik because he does good things. All right. Now we see that he's attacked by a Russia. So how do we understand that? It's a good guy. Why is the Russia attacking him? There shouldn't be. Says Rav Huna that pasuk comes to give us a chiddush. The chiddush is, yes, that will happen. A Russia will attack a tzaddik, and you're going to stand on the sideline. But that will never happen to a tzaddik gomer. Now, that's a very tough word to swallow. What does that mean, a tzaddik gomer? Who's a tzaddik gomer? I mean, we all try to do good things. Are we tzaddikim gemurim? Maybe, maybe not.
What's the criteria?
What's the criteria to be called a tzaddik gomer? Do you have to be a gadol b'Yisrael? Do you have to be the Rosh Yeshiva? Do you have to be, without mentioning names, who do you have to be? So, but again, Rav Huna wants to, this is all an ecclesiastical exercise. This is not something that you and I can of our own say, oh, this fella is a good guy, but not such a good guy that I have to really intervene. But if it was the Rav, oh, you betcha I'd intervene because he's a tzaddik gomer. So it's a tough thing to understand, but Rav Huna is trying to draw a parallel that, and again, maybe the parallel is very much apropos because it's all a mystery. It's all an ambiguity. So do we always consider someone to be a tzaddik gomer and do what we have to do? In other words, is this what Chazal, the Navi is telling us? Always be at the ready to jump in because maybe he's a tzaddik gomer and you're going to miss the opportunity. That's the question. That's the
Rabbi,
question.
I don't understand. So can I ask a couple questions to clarify?
This is not easy, Michael. I'm going to tell you, it's not easy.
But first of all, when they say attack, is that physical or not? It could be anything, or is it just physical?
I think it's anything that's a negative for the tzaddik. In other words, anything.
So and then in terms of the tzaddik and the tzaddik gomer and people standing on the sidelines, there are a lot of times where you may see somebody do wrong to a person, but it may not be appropriate for you because it's one-on-one to step in and take the initiative. But I don't understand that he's saying for a tzaddik gomer that you will definitely intervene, or whether it's because it's tzaddik gomer, it won't have any, it will not stay there. It will be repelled. So I'm really struggling with what's meant by this. So is he saying that if it's a tzaddik gomer, you'll of course rush to his aid, or is he saying because it's a tzaddik gomer, it will not penetrate, it will not be effective?
Right. So this is the question that Rashi, other Mefarshim, other Rishonim asked the question, and the example that's given from the Navi is the battle between Klal Yisrael and Bavel, where Nebuchadnezzar, Melech Bavel, fought against King Chizkiyahu. Klal Yisrael was not, shall we say, at its best, but it was better than Bavel. So here you have a Russia who is attacking not a perfect Klal Yisrael, but nevertheless a more righteous people. So it's Russia who's Mavaleya, who tries to swallow the tzaddik, right? And yet you, the Rebbeinu Shalom, stand on the side and don't do anything. Why didn't you let us win that battle? Why'd you let Nebuchadnezzar win the battle? So in a historical sense, what this pasuk is telling us is, Ribono Shel Olam, we're not perfect, but we're better than the next guy, and you're allowing the next guy to beat us up.
Yeah,
Why
but
is that right? Why
we
is that
can
fair?
we could say the same thing about being avodim in Mitzrayim. We were supposed to stay there for 410 years, and there's
Right.
so many things that occurred, and it was harsher, and God stood aside, but He then got us out much sooner than we were supposed to get
But
out.
why we were in that position in the first place? You're right. So no, the question is the same: is how do you allow something like that to happen?
But is this within our purview, in our, in Yiddishkeit? It's in God's hands. There's no, I mean, you may be able to say person is a tzaddik gomer because you know of how they act, but are we really humans on this earth able to judge that, or is really Hakadosh Baruch Hu the true judge, Dayan, to evaluate that?
Right. So you hit the nail on the head. In other words, these are philosophical questions that the Maimon, the true believer, says what you just said. How can I get my arms around this and understand this other than saying I'm a Maimon? And I believe that the Ribono Shel Olam will do the right thing. In other words, I do not have the ability to wrestle with this, as you just pointed out, Michael. Philosophically, I can sit and have a discussion with you, and we can debate it, and we can say this, that, and the other. But at the end of the day, what does it boil down to? Animame b'muna shlema. If you have a muna, then you say the Ribono Shel Olam is hurting Klal Yisrael, but it's not really hurting because, and then you fill in the blank. But if you're not a Maimon and you say no, has nothing to do with God, has nothing to do with sort of the spiritual forces. It's just a physical battle. Someone will win, someone will lose, and this, that, and the other. Then that's what you believe. But then you're left with all these questions. See, if you're a Maimon, you don't have the questions because your last answer is I have a moon on the Ribono Shel Olam. I mean, Holocaust, inquisitions, murders, all
And
the
isn't
things
that
that.
Rav Huna's point, that the difference between a tzaddik and a tzaddik gomer is someone who will not ask that question? A tzaddik may be a good guy and say, "Why is this happening to me?" But a tzaddik gomer will understand that it's in God's hands, so I don't ever have to worry about it.
Yes, yes. Inherently, I think that's exactly what Rav Huna is coming to tell us, is that a tzaddik gomer ain't a baleya. A tzaddik gomer will never be swallowed permanently. There may be bumps along the road, like and again, you draw a parallel, but it's hard to even discuss it. When we lose such a large segment of Klal Yisrael, which today could have done so much more Kiddush Hashem. You ask, Ribono Shel Olam, why'd you do that? You could have had double, triple the amount of Jews who would be Mekadosh Shem Shemayim. Doesn't that mean something? Doesn't that mean something? So how do we answer that? We don't. I mean, you can't answer that. The teretz is that what Rav Huna is saying is, like you just said, you have to reckon that a tzaddik gomer will not be totally swallowed, and we want to consider ourselves tzaddikim gemurim. So what happens temporarily happens, but in the end result, a tzaddik gomer will never be swallowed. So in the battle between Nebuchadnezzar and Chizkiyahu, Klal Yisrael was beaten very badly, but they rose again. So in other words, we do consider them tzaddikim gemurim. But at that time, the Ribono Shel Olam said, no, I will not. And that's, again, in our human minds, if we exercise our mental capacity, that's the toughest thing that we can possibly deal with.
We also know that the reward isn't always for us. It could be our
Right.
future
It could be the future.
generations are the ones getting rewarded. So we may have something happen to us that's really terrific. We don't know if it was something that I did or was it my grandfather.
Exactly. You're 100%
So
right.
you
And
can't
then when
answer
Rabbi
these
Lazar
things.
says mismatan ve'ena olin or mismatan va'olin, that's in the future, which you're not necessarily going to be able to trace and say, oh, I'm getting rewarded because my great grandfather did something very special. Although we hear these phenomenal stories about, I mean, they come out much later because they were hidden for a long period of time, where someone, you're right, someone's grandchild uncovers a situation where his grandfather, grandmother, whoever did something and it sort of went unfulfilled, unnoticed, and everything else. And then generations later, it comes to light and there's such a fantastic positive result. Again, are we connecting the dots? Are we saying that the schus of that act now comes back in later generations? So tough questions to deal with, but on our level to understand, the Torah is basically saying not everything is all good or all bad. When something is bad, there's a reason why it's bad, because basically the Rosh wants to do good by us. But doing good by us is not always the best for us. We may not see it that way, but in the Kaviyachol, in the eyes of the Rebbeinu Shalom, this is the best for us.
But
And maybe it's meant to be, Jay, that we plow the field, don't harvest, and let our children or grandchildren harvest,
right,
and
right.
they'll be the ultimate
But
beneficiaries.
also, the same thing seems to apply when people go to a tzaddik for a bracha.
Right,
A bracha can show up 2 generations later. It doesn't have to necessarily show up that the bracha works for you.
right.
We see that.
Yes, yeah,
We
we
see
do.
that when people went to the Lubavitcher Rebbe or to this one or this tremendous Talmud Chacham or whatever, that somehow years later something happens to the grandchildren
Right.
that, you know,
And seemingly it has no connection, right?
yeah, yeah.
No question about it. No question about
So
it.
the system cannot be analyzed as a complete system that would the way we would think of other things.
Right.
You don't change the battery's going to go, you'll get stuck on the side of the road.
Yep.
It's not Hashem's fault, that kind of stuff. But it's a constant wrestle because it's too easy to overanalyze.
That's right. No,
And
exactly. That's why
it's not healthy anymore.
right.
To
I think what this message is, and again, I say it, that's very tough to internalize. We live our lives. We do what we have to do. We try to do the right thing. We make a judgment call. Yeah, I think I can help. No, I don't think I can help. I'll help next time. I won't lend now. I'll lend later. Everybody makes a cheshbon. Everybody makes a cheshbon, and you do the best. And if you're a good person, you'll make the right cheshbon. I can't really do it right now. I have some money, but I'm not ready to make a loan. Does that mean I'm a bad guy because I didn't make the loan today? Again, these are the things that I think at the end of the day, when you learn this and you want to practice this, this should be in the back of your mind as a possible guide. You know what? I have the ability. Let me go ahead and do it. If one person is moved because they learned this Indian and says, this tells me that I have to be better and I have to lend and not just sit on the side with my money, then the Gemara already has a positive impact on us because someone took to heart that this is the right way. That's all the Gemara can do. That's all the Torah. Torah is a guide. This is what you should do. You then apply and do the best you can in your own mind. The Rebbeinu Shalom will, Yodea Machshavas, he knows what you're thinking about, but at the same time, he gives you the brera to make that decision. He's not forcing you to say, oh, you have a couple dollars, go ahead and lend it. No, that doesn't work that way. But so I think both of these Gemaras, whether it's the first case or the case of a tzaddik in a Russia, really kind of speak to us in a similar fashion. Is that if you're going to do good, the Rebbeinu Shalom will ultimately repay you. How, when, where, what? Nobody knows. Nobody knows. But you should be assured that it will happen. I think that's maybe the best message is that you have the comfort and the assurance that something good will happen. That tips the scale in the favor of, yeah, let me go ahead and do it. I don't know how this is going to play out, but it can't play out bad. I'm a believer. It can't play out bad. It's got to be good. All right. So those are two different, they say the same thing, but now we're going to talk about something a little bit different to what Menashe was talking about. And that is, and this is a different conundrum.
By the way, Rabbi, excuse me.
Yeah,
All of this, believe, applies to a nation, to Eretz Yisrael, when you see things going on.
for sure.
You
The example that was given when Rashi brought down, he brought down the example of the battle between Nebuchadnezzar
Yeah.
and
We have it today in our world.
right.
Goes on with Eretz Israel every day.
Exactly right. It plays itself out again, for sure. So it happens on our level personally, it happens on a national level,
Yeah.
right? So what happens with one is really a life's lesson. It isn't different. We're not different than a nation. Of course, we are just an individual, but the same cheshbonos come into play, the same questions, the same issues come into play, whether it's an individual, a group, a family, a nation. Just it becomes bigger, but it doesn't become different. It's really the same question. So now, Rebbe had some questions. He had some deep questions on the psukim in the Torah. He didn't quite understand, and this whole next sugya will go to that. So we'll start it, but keep in mind that what seems to be fairly straightforward, Rebbe has trouble with. Okay, so there's certain halachas we know. We know that an Eved Ivri and an Eved Kanani are different. An Eved Kanani, a non-Jewish a slave, is a slave. There's different halachas. There's things you can do, there's things you can't do. There certainly are. There's a different approach. An Eved Ivri is really someone who sells himself into servitude, either because he's so poor and destitute that he cannot support a family, so he basically becomes an Eved so that he can support a family, or he's sold because of a punishment, because he did something that requires penance or repayment, and he doesn't have the ability, so he is sold into servitude, and the money it's never for free. You pay him, but that money doesn't go to him. It goes to the person to whom he is responsible, someone he stole from, or whatever he did. So the halachas are different for an Eved Ivri and for an Eved Kanani. Right. Now, when we talk about a ger, there's two gerim in the Torah, the ger tzedek and the ger toshav. Ger tzedek is a ger, a proselyte who does it al pi tzedek, meaning he does it halachic, and he becomes a true, full-fledged member of the Jewish nation. And ger toshav is someone who's not quite there, but he's Mekayim Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, and the Torah gave him rights. One of the rights is to live in Eretz Yisrael. A goy should not live in Eretz Yisrael, but someone who's a ger toshav, because at least he fulfills the mitzvahs of Avram and Achai and killing and all these other things, the seven mitzvahs. So then he has a little bit of a dispensation. Not that he's a Jew, but that he's a ger toshav. So these are two different categories. Now the Gemara wants to pursue that and understand what each category allows and doesn't allow. Ger tzedek omer le'in mechira, when it talks about selling an Eved, right? It talks about a ger tzedek, and the ger toshav omer le'in ribis. So the Rebbe distinguished that when it says ger v'toshav, it's not one and the same. When it says ger, it means a ger tzedek regarding the issues that apply to a Jewish proselyte, someone who has become a full member of Klal Yisrael. There are halachas. That's what it means to be a ger. When it says toshav in the pasuk, says Rebbe v'ger toshav omer le'inyan ribis. But the word ger toshav has nothing to do with someone who sells himself or someone who's indebted or whatever else. That portion of the pasuk deals specifically with ribis, meaning, can you lend with interest to someone who is not a full member of Klal Yisrael? Interestingly, the Gemara says, the Rebbe says, En yedea mahu. I don't understand it. the pasuk means that, but I don't understand what the pasuk is saying. That ger refers to a ger tzedek, legabe one inyan, and toshav refers to a ger toshav about another inyan. In other words, the pasuk is so wide open, it doesn't talk about the same thing for two different people. Oh, a ger tzedek can do this with regard to selling. A ger toshav can do this with regard to selling. In other words, same inyan, two different outcomes. Rebbe says no. What the pasuk is telling us is there are two types of gerim, and the pasuk is revealing that the discussion among these two are not intertwined. The ger is talking about a ger tzedek about what you can do to sell him, and a ger toshav is talking about ribbis. The ger tzedek is not talking about ribbis, and the ger toshav is not talking about selling himself. So Rebbe is confused. How do I understand? Am I right? In other words, is my interpretation right that this is how we're to learn the pasuk of ger v'toshav, that one is about one total inyan and one is about another inyan? Again, this is not really connected to what we said before, but as I said, it's different vignettes, different pictures about the inyan of ribbis. So with regard to ribbis, this brisa that Rebbe says is what we're talking about. That there's an inyan of ribbis or issue of ribbis with regard to Ter Shoshav, in other words, discussion of ribbis regarding Ter Shoshav. But Legabe Ger Tzedek, there's no discussion of ribbis. It has to do with the ability of the ger to sell himself into slavery. Okay, so now we're going to dig deep into Rebbe, and we're going to try to understand what's Rebbe really telling us. Says the Gemara, Ger Tzedek ha'omer le'inyan mechira. So we're going to understand Rebbe, that when Rebbe says Ger Tzedek, it has to do not with interest, but it has to do with selling himself as an Eved. How do we know that that's what Ger Tzedek means? How do you know that? So the Gemara says, the Ksiv, we're going to learn that from a pasuk. What is the pasuk? The pasuk says, this is all again from Vayikra, where we talk about this whole subject matter. We have a pasuk in the Torah, and what does that pasuk says? Again, the word yomoch, meaning he's diminished. If a person's diminished, meaning he's poor among you, v'nim kalach, and he again, he's sold to you, meaning he is sold to you by Bezdin because he did something bad, or he's selling himself because of poverty. We have two different approaches to that. So that's what the pasuk says, that with regard to that kind of person, v'lo l'cha, he may come to you as another Jew and say, I want to sell myself to you, give me money so I can do restitution or I can help my family and I'll work for you. So we learn v'lo l'cha, and not just for you, el leger. But also he can come to a ger. Shenemar, shenemar leger. In other words, this situation is going to be where a person is going to sell himself as an Eved. To whom is he going to sell himself? To another Jew. And he's going to say, okay, give me $100, I can pay off my debt, and then I'll go, and again, he will go free after a certain period of time because that's the halacha. But the pasuk doesn't mean that he sells himself just to a Jew.
Not only a Jew.
Not only a Jew, el leger. He sells himself to a ger tzedek. So now this Eved Ivri is being owned by a ger tzedek, who's paying him money for compensation, and then he will be allowed free.
What's the chiddush here?
Right?
No, is there a chiddush here to a ger?
So listen to this. So when it says ger, the Gemara is saying, v'lo ger tzedek, not only to a ger tzedek is he selling himself, ela leger toshav. He's selling himself to a ger toshav, who by our definition is not a Jew. He's a ger. We call him a ger, but he's a ger toshav. So now you have a Jew selling himself to a non-Jew to fulfill the mitzvahs of an Eved Ivri. That's what it would seem. Shenemar, why do we say that? Now, this is all trying to understand Rebbe. Remember, Rebbe says, I have, I'm in a quandary because I learned ger to mean only ger tzedek and toshav to mean ger toshav. But according to this Gemara, what we're now learning is that an Eved Ivri sells himself and it says to a ger. And we're interpreting v'lo leger tzedek, that the ger doesn't mean just ger tzedek, and leger toshav. It means to a non-Jewish ger, a ger toshav. Why do we say that? Shenemar leger toshav. The pasuk says, "V'chi yomuch achicha imoch v'nim kaloch," and then it says a ger v'toshav. So how do we distinguish in this particular case that he can't sell himself to a ger toshav? So that's what Rebbe is trying to wrestle with. How do we understand the pasuk, right? So he sold himself to a ger toshav, and the pasuk, if we look at the pasuk in Vayikra, it says mishpachas ger, that he sold to the family of a ger. What is the family of a ger? Zehanochri. This is the ger toshav, the non-Jewish ger. Kishuhu omer. When the pasuk says "Ola Aker," it goes on to say, or to an Aker. Aker means avodah zara. That means he sold to an idol. In other words, this pasuk is open-ended. How do we learn this pasuk? If a person wants to sell himself because he needs the money, who can he sell himself to? A ger tzedek, a ger toshav. The family of a ger, meaning totally at least the ger toshav has some schusim. But what happens if he has a family who has no schusim? Or he sells himself for idols. It doesn't mean idol worship. It means doing things for idols. But nevertheless, in other words, it's not yarek v'al yavor because it's one of the three cardinal sins that he's worshiping avodah zara. It means that he's doing things to help the avodah zara. Okay, he chops wood for the avodah zara, whatever it happens to be.
He's supporting avodah zara.
He's supporting the avodah zara, not worshiping, but supporting the avodah zara. Right. So l'chayra, from this pasuk, all of these things are possible because we don't have an explanation specifically that it means a ger tzedek. Rebbe is saying that, but how does Rebbe know it? In other words, the fact that it says ger v'toshav, it could be that all of these things of a Jewish servant selling himself to a non-Jew or to a non-Jew's family or whatever happens to be. Right?
Yeah.
So this becomes the question. We see all these things are possible. Omar Mar, now let's understand Mar is Rebbe. Omar Mar, v'lo l'cho el leger, and he's selling himself not only to you, a Yid, a Jew, but to a ger, meaning a ger tzedek, shenem leger, lememra de ger koni eved ivri. So now Rebbe's asking the question: if we're saying at the very basic level that when it says leger, that a eved ivri can sell himself to a ger tzedek, right? Very beginning of the chain, to a ger tzedek, lememra de ger koni eved ivri. Are you going to tell me that a ger tzedek, is allowed to buy an Eved Ivri for Raminu? That's a stira to a brisa. The brisa says, "Ein hager nikna be'Eved Ivri," that a ger cannot be purchased by an Eved Ivri, ve'en isha v'ger konem Eved Ivri, and neither can a woman or a ger buy an Eved Ivri. So Rebbe is saying, I'm puzzled. You're trying to explain this brisa to me, and you start by saying that when it says ger, it means a ger tzedek. So at the very least, a Eved Ivri can be purchased by a ger tzedek. Forget about ger toshav or family, everything else. Let's put that aside. But at least he can be bought by an Eved Ivri. Do you really mean that? The brisa says, "Ein hager nikna be'Eved Ivri," that an Eved Ivri can only be bought by a full-fledged Jew, not by a ger tzedek. Or even further, a woman and a ger cannot own an Eved Ivri. It's the flip side of it, but it's kind of saying the same thing, is that an Eved Ivri only can deal with a full-fledged Jew, male, not female. We'll see why, but only with a male. So how can you learn this whole pshat that a ger, when it says ger, it means a ger tzedek or a ger toshav or the family of a ger that has nothing to do with the toshav or idol support of idols. The very basic concept doesn't work because the Brisa says that that an Eved Ivri can only sell himself to another Jew, not even to a Ger Tzedek. So this is part of the conundrum that Rebbe has when Rebbe says, here's how we learn out the pasuk, but I don't get it. If the pasuk says Ger Tzedek Amalein Mechira, that Ger Tzedek is with regard to Mechira, meaning selling himself, that can't be. There is a brisa that says that a ger tzedek cannot own an Eved Ivri, or an Eved Ivri can't sell himself to a ger tzedek. So how do we reconcile? How does Rebbe reconcile the pasuk the way he understands it with what the brisa telling us? Again, remember that these brisas were mentioned by different Tanoim, kind of around the same time. They didn't all make it into the Mishnah, but they were all contemporaneous, so that when one Tana was saying something, another Tana who he may or may not have interacted with was saying something else, and those two discussions may not have been harmonious. That's why he asked Akasha, you're telling me that you can do this. Wait a minute, there's another brisa from someone else who says you can't do it. And remember, an Amora, you can't slug up a Tana, but one Tana can have a dispute with another Tana because they're kind of in the same plateau, they're in the same level. So how do we understand Rebbe when Rebbe says this? Says the Gemara that you know what that brisa is coming to tell us? Ger lo nikna be'eved ivri. A ger cannot be purchased, cannot purchase an eved ivri. Why? V'shav el mishpachto be'inan. Because the second half of the pasuk by Eved Ivri is that after his 7 years of servitude, he goes back to his family, mishpachto, goes back to his family. For whole leka, and in the case of a ger, that can't happen. Why? Because a ger has no family, technically speaking, right? In other words, if someone is Magayer, it's Gekatan Shenola Dami. His previous family, non-Jewish family, is not halachically his family. So when the whole principle of avdos, of servitude, comes back, you know why a ger cannot be really a ger can be purchased by a yid. Why can't he be purchased by a ger? Because the servant is the shavel mishpachto, and he has no mishpacha to come back to. Therefore, we're going to see this later, that a ger can more easily be acquired by a non-Jew to whom this halacha doesn't apply than a Jew to whom this halacha applies, because the halacha is you have to let him out to his family, and he has no family to go back to. So basically, what we're saying is that the reason why a ger cannot be purchased by evidently can't be purchased by a ger is because of a specific reason.
Can't go back. Yeah.
He can't go back. So an Eved Ivri can only be purchased by another Ivri, by another Jew, but not by someone for whom this halacha doesn't apply, because he's got to let him out. Where's he going to go? He has nowhere to go. Okay. Now,
the fact that he can't go anywhere, why should that kill this idea?
Well, again, he's saying that in order to be exactly on par with the lashon of the Torah, there's a requirement that an Eved be allowed after 7 years to go back to his family.
Well, suppose there is no family.
Right. So it's right
And
because
no, with you, with the right kind of case, there may not be a family to go back to.
right. And if there's no family to go back to, that's why inherently the ger you can't be sold to a ger because there will be no family to go back to. If he's sold to another, if Eved Ivri sold to a Yid, after 7 years he goes back to his family. He has a family. He goes back to his family. But the Eved, but the ger the ger uh,
No, but I was asking. He was a Jew. This Ger.
is ger,
He sells himself.
right?
His family is not living anymore by the time the 7 years are up.
No, no, but he inherently he has no family. The definition of a Eved Ivri is someone who can be returned to his family. You're right, the family may have died, whatever else, but he has a family that he could potentially come back to. A Ger Tzedek has never had, doesn't have a family to come back to.
So
Therefore,
at the beginning, when he
at the
sells
beginning,
himself,
right?
there
So
is a family, and that condition is met.
right, which is why I said, just to get ahead of ourselves for a little bit, is that it'll be easier for a Eved, for a Ger, to sell himself to a non-Jew who doesn't have the mitzvah of returning him after 7 years. He can hold him for whatever, right? So this will be a situation where the Ger Tzedek it's better to sell him to a non-Jew than to a Jew because the Jew can't fulfill the mitzvah of
Return.
returning. So, in other words, okay. So again, this is somewhat confusing because what we see,
It's a strange topic.
it's a strange topic because what we're touching on different things that one sort of is not connected to the other. So let's just complete this thought. Ve'ein isha of a ger konen eved ivri, and it also says that a woman or a ger cannot, in that brisa, cannot own an eved ivri. Isha, a woman, I understand. Lav orach ara. It's not appropriate for her. A ger nami, also a ger. Uh, why? For a woman, we understand because she shouldn't buy a Jewish servant, and then she's alone. And she's again, we're assuming she's alone. Then she can't be with a Jewish male alone. So she's going to buy a ger. If an Isha is going to buy an Eved Ivri, that will be anathema to the whole halacha of Yichud, let's just say, right? Ger Nami, but also a Ger can't buy an Eved Ivri, right? Because Gemiri, it's a tradition, it's a topic. The Miknekoni that only someone who can um, own someone who can be owned. That you can only own if you can be owned, right? Velo mikda lo kani. But someone who can't be owned cannot own. And that's what we just said before, that if you can't be owned because of the mitzvah of being able to come back, then you yourself can't own. In other words, you have to have the ability to be owned in order to own, right? So, what's the bottom line? That a ger can't buy an Eved Ivri, right? Um, so that comes back to the question: why in the pasuk where it says ger omelanian mechira, when it says legabi selling a Eved Ivri, it uses the term ger. A ger can never be someone who buys an Eved Ivri because he himself can't be bought. So the upshot of all of this is to go back to the question that Rebbe asked is, I don't understand it. It says ger, Omelin Mechira, that the whole topic of gerus has to do with selling a slave. How does that even come into question? The term ger and the term slave are anathema. They can't work. So that's why Rebbe said, I don't understand what the pasuk is telling me. The pasuk is telling me that gerus has to do with mechira. What do you mean it has to do with mechira? There can't be any mechira for all the reasons we just quoted, is because of the halacha. Either, well, primarily the halacha that a ger doesn't have the ability to come back
He returned.
after 7 years. So, or up to Shvius. It could be less than 7 years. So that's Rebbe's kasha. Rebbe's kasha is I don't understand what this is all about. So, in order to answer the question, let's just finish. Omar Rab Nachman by Yitzchak. You know, Rab Nachman Yitzchak comes and says, "Ein kona v'dina b'Yisrael." That a ger cannot buy an ever ivri and have the halachis of a ivri. Avokona v'dina kanochri, but he can buy a eved, and the laws that will apply are the laws of an eved kanani. This is really very striking because, in other words, it's telling us that a ger, sure, a ger can buy an eved ivri, but he can't let him out after 7 years because by a goy, your servitude is forever. So you sell yourself to a ger, you're now stuck
To a goy.
with the halachas of a goy.
Yeah.
And not only that, but there's also other halachas having to do with if you do discharge him, an Eved Ivri, you have to give him his wife and children if he got married. An Eved Kanani, the Eved goes, the family stays. So if he's considered purchased by a goy, by a nachri, then he can leave, but his family can't leave.
Yeah.
So you have an anomaly here where yes, you can sell, but you can't be treated like the halachas of a yid, and that makes it very, very complicated. And that really goes to Rebbe's conundrum: is how do I understand this pasuk? This whole pasuk is upside down because it doesn't. In other words, I'm learning the words of the pasuk, and the pasuk says ger legabe mechira, right? And toshav legabe ribis. What does it mean, ger legabe mechira? How does that work? So we just went through the whole Gemara.
But it doesn't close.
What's that?
It doesn't close on itself properly.
That's right. That's right. Right.
All right.
Right. So, okay. And then the final word is because the Tanya, hanirtza. What is a nirtza? A nirtza is a person who sells himself, and then he's entitled to go out. And then by Yovel, he says, "I want to stay." So we put his ear against the door. We pierce him. And we say a certain pasuk that you're selling yourself even though you're supposed to be obligated to the Rebbeinu Shalom. And what does the pasuk say? Eina over lo es haben v'lo es habas. And under this circumstance, the ger will not serve the so now we're going to make a chilik between a ger and an eved ivri. That an eved ivri, if he does nirtza, then he can be sold to the master son, not a daughter, but he can be sold to the master son. But a ger who becomes a nirtza and you want to pierce his ear, then if the parent, the owner, master dies, then he doesn't stay, because normally with the nirtza you stay forever. He doesn't stay either for the son or the daughter. So now we see, this is the raya, that there's a chilek between being servitude to a Jew or servitude to a Nachri, because if you do nirtza, then the halachas with regard to a non-Jew don't apply. I mean, you don't come out, you serve a daughter, you serve a son, it doesn't matter. But so this price is telling us that the proof that there's a chilik here between a Jew and a non-Jew is the nirtza, where nirtza is let totally free to another Jew, but not to a goy. Therefore, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, when he wants to answer the question, he answers it by saying that yes, you can be kone the ger, but only with the halachas of a non-Jew, not with the halachas of a Jew, because we said with the halachas of a Jew it doesn't work. So you'll have the situation where he'll sell himself, and we're going to treat him as if he sold himself to a nachri, and unfortunately he'll be stuck. So that's pshat. And what Rebbe is wanting to say is that a ger tzedek omer le'inyan mechira means that this whole discussion that we just completed is that a ger tzedek can be sold, but the halachas of a non-Jew will apply, not the halachas of a Jew. Again, Rebbe wants to make a chilik between ger and toshav. One has to do with bechira, one has to do with ribis. And then we asked Rebbe didn't understand the brisa. At the end of the brisa, we reconciled by saying that Rebbe says, yes, I understand that you can sell a ger to another to a Jew, but the halachas that apply are the halachas as if he sold himself to a non-Jew, because you can't, for all the reasons we said, the ger can't be someone who sells himself to a Jew because he himself can't be inherited, etc. All the reasons we said. So at the end of the day, it can happen, but you treat him as if he was sold to a goy, to a nachri. So that ends that part of the equation. Rebbe still has a problem with ger tosha, which we'll talk about next week, but at least with regard to the ger, and this is very, very twisted because we're going back and forth to try to understand what Rebbe means when he says that a ger tzedek can be sold to a Jew. How can it be sold to a Jew? We had all these questions. At the end of the day, he can be sold to a Jew, but treated like a goy. So, and again, we don't really halachic. That's not really what happens today. But when you think of it in terms of the times of the Gemara, if a person had to sell himself, then and it was a ger tzedek, he had a problem, because he couldn't sell himself to a he couldn't sell himself. That was a big problem. In any event, that's how the Gemara wants to answer this. And then Mitchell, next week we're going to pick up on the second half of Rebbe's conundrum and figure out what it means toshav that he can with regard to ribis.